And we are live. There's the rattle, rattle, click, click, rattle, rattle, click, click. Someday we'll have sound for all of this stuff. I can imagine the kind of things that go on, little rattle, rattle, click, click stuff. But we were having trouble with bandwidth and a lot of other things. But at the very least, it's got some pretty pictures at the part. Troubles in Paradise. I'm Rulin James Downard, or RJ, as people maybe wanted to call me. My website, tortuganwordpress.com. If you don't have this on your speed dial or your bookmark on your smartphone, why the hell not? This is my work here. This is what you should have. You could draw on it. So we'll stop our little sharing here and proceed with this episode of our happy little program. I'm R.J. Downard, and I'm trying to destroy creationism one source at a time. Cap is here, Cap Brony, who is another person who is aware of the fact that creationism is a pile of dingoes' kidneys. And what I've been doing, I'm trying to show everybody the techniques of what I call source methods. You could call it anything you like, clear reasoning, it doesn't really matter. But it's how you approach data from the bottom up rather than from philosophy down. And it's not that you don't pay attention to the upper levels, but you also pay attention to what's going on in the bottom. Oh, Animal Man's just dropped into there. Hi. And I'll say just hi back. Anyway, what I'm doing in this for the next quite a few weeks, plus whatever else we discuss along the way, is Contested Bones, this book on creationist view of human evolution by Christopher Rupe and Juan Sanford. Juan Sanford is the genetic entropy guy who thinks that supposedly genetics, which is his field, he's got a degree in it, would be mutating so fast if evolution were true that we would all be dead by now, and that there's this load of genetic entropy. And he tried to document it in his book, which I finally got a copy of, and I'm going, no, you haven't. It's terrible. You haven't shown that at all. Thanks for saying hi to Animal Man. So what I've been doing on this is doing a full court press analysis of the sources, which is not rocket science. It's straightforward analysis. Page by page, they're making an argument. They either cite sources for it or they don't. If they cite a source, I track it down. And I'm not opening up the spreadsheet this time. The previous videos showed a little bit of that. But as I'm plugging material in, I'm putting in, is it a technical source or is it a general source? What is it being used for? Is it just being used for an authority quote, or are they paying attention to the content of the paper? And as it turns out at the moment, they're still running about 2/3 of their argument is just for authority quotes, independent of whether it's a technical source or not. And then the other issue is, if they're citing a technical source, are they getting the facts right or not? Or are they using it just as a stating the obvious? Or are they using it for an authority quote? Or are they making an actual point off of it? And if they do, is it supporting their position? Well, about 1/3 of their technical sources so far, they're just missing the data. They're getting it wrong. And that's a pretty bad rate on it. So what I put up, there's more than the usual number of technical papers in the linkages in the description this time around, because this is just over a couple pages of stuff. It's about Neanderthals, our good old pals, the Neanderthals. And their argument is Neanderthals are just people. They're just perfectly normal people that just have big brow ridges and no chin. And the problem is we now know a lot more about the biology and the species concept and gene flow and how hybridization can occur in relatively closely related genuses and all that. And the view that Neanderthals are just human beings that have some peculiar characteristics ain't cutting it, not in this century. And so you can see that when you're looking at how Rupe, who apparently was the guy that did all the research, Sanford admits that Rupe did all the heavy lifting, and he doesn't lift very heavy, because the sources he would get are often ridiculously dated. So I started off with one of the first ones on the list relates to this Arnsberg guy, Baruch Arnsberg, and he has an article that turns out to be just an abstract of a paper he presented back in 1991. And I put the linkage up to the listing from the American Journal of Anthropology, or American Journal of Physical Anthropology, where they listed off all the different presenters that were at this conference, and that's one of them. on page 44. And you can go read it. And there's another paper as well that was in that. And all the creationists did was nick some authority quotes from it. They didn't really deal with the data. Well, the problem is the guy has not stopped working, and the field hasn't stopped working. So I put in a citation from a paper that you can read full text from 7 years later that he wrote on this very subject. And you can see all the information that's not getting mentioned by the creationists, where they're just pointing out very specific blips and things. The brow ridge issue is the one that pops up even in human beings. There's a dynamic thing that goes on way deep in the genes, and they haven't worked out all as about brain growth and the degree to which brow ridge encephalization is a kind of a side byproduct of that. There's a whole bunch of side material, and I'm not diving into that aspect of it. But the thing that sticks out like a sore thumb, that doesn't stick out like a sore thumb about Neanderthals, is they don't have a chin. Their bones go straight down right from the mouth. It's very different. No human being has a jaw like that. And what they're finding in a lot of these ones that you go farther back, hundreds of thousands of years ago, this issue, chin or not chin, brow ridge or not brow ridge, and width of the skull or not, all of the dynamics are showing a range of variations. And in the years since 1991, they found more Neanderthal examples, they found more genetic examples, they found more of these almost Neanderthals and not quite. And so this Mladek find in Czechoslovakia, there's a whole bunch of papers that I put up about that, where Arsuaga, they cite one of Arsuaga's papers from back in 1993 again. Well, that's a long time ago, and they haven't stopped work. So I put the link to the paper from 93 that you can read. I also put the links up to two of their more recent works, 2014 and 2015. That's more recent. And now you can see how the field has advanced in their understanding of the human diversity and all of that. And you can get an impression of why would they leave that work out from their analysis repeatedly. Not once in a while is Rupe missing the more recent follow-up work. It's not that they don't cite stuff from the 21st century, but it's not follow-up work. So what seems to be the case is that dreaded secondary citation addiction, to where they're scavenging around for an authority quote that matches what they want to be true. And the little blips and pieces that they can put on the little things, you can imagine in their head, they've got the equivalent of that forensics conspiracy theory things where you've got the thing up on the wall with a bunch of little red line strings attached to it all. And that's as far as it goes. Instead of letting the data speak, looking at all the data and then following up with more data to find out what the whole landscape is before you jump off the cliff.
Well, RJ, they can't let the data speak for itself, because if they allowed that to happen, well, then they wouldn't be young Earth creationists anymore.
Exactly. And that's why this methods approach is so bloody useful, because there's a lot of people I bump into in the secular community who are certain that there are some creationists that know they're telling lies. They know they're wrong, and they're just going at it because they're making money at it, or they want to lead people to Jesus, and so they're willing to lie up the yin yang. Whereas from a source methods direction, it's much more reasonable to think, and I've done this in my own mind when I was 18 or 20 years old, where you're addicted to secondary sources and all that, before I learned sound method. So it's my equivalent of being a creationist, to where ex-creationists can tell you what's going on in their heads. I can tell you what went on in my head when I was a non-evolutionist, believing in psychic phenomenon, all sorts of stuff back when I was 18, 19, 20. That you realize that, no, you believe it's true. You think you've got the interesting bit, and you find the little bits that fit and you stick with them, but you don't necessarily follow up much. And that'll stand out like a sore thumb when you do source analysis. Anybody can do it. Plus you learn stuff. When you follow up the research and look up what the original material is and see what it is to try to understand it, then that's when you'll be more easily able to spot the stuff they're leaving out. And most of the arguments that people who believe things that aren't true are not errors of overt errors, but they're errors of omission. They're things that they neglect to include. that limited data field. Remember,
Yeah.
anti-evolutionists missed 90% of the data field. So
Yeah.
they can make a creationist image just like Eric von Daniken can make a ancient astronaut worldview. And he's got sources, he's got incidents, he's got sculptures that he puts on in his pictures, but it is leaving out most of the stuff.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, it's that aspect of it that I've been trying to instill in everybody that I bump into, that it's not something that should be used occasionally. It's the first line of defense.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, on the learning something, I mean, I've had a couple arguments with friends who are, with mainly one friend who's a yak, and I
Yeah, being young
don't
Earth
know.
creation.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just saying that, but yeah, I mean, who is one, and I've learned more probably about evolution and things, that, because like I knew a base understanding, and I've had arguments with him on it, but I've learned more in cosmology, um astronomy, biology, things in those lines, just trying to keep up with some of his arguments, and
Yeah.
to point out some of the arguments. I mean, and heck, I know I've shared a few interesting things that I've come across when looking for them with you, and I'm like, yeah.
And
I
never
mean,
forget the basic methods questions. There was a debate recently between on Steve McRae's channel with a flat earther, and they had an Australian
and
cosmologist student, cosmology, astrophysics student on, that was criticizing this other woman who was the flat earther. And I only stayed for about a half hour because it was just driving me up the wall, because they were all missing methods questions. That instead of, yes, it's fine to say, here's the evolutionary position, here's the physical data, and so forth. That's perfectly fine.
yeah.
But at one point, the lady said that she was sure evolution was wrong because her aunt had told her so. And you go, why does did you fact check your aunt? What sources did your aunt rely on? That would be a methods question. And it literally didn't occur to them to ask that at that point. And if you're missing that opportunity, the best question to keep always in your head is says who and how did you check it?
Yeah, and that's, I said, what I learned from you is I would make my point of what I was saying that I said was accurate, and then I would post there were a few I had to go digging for, but I would try and find a primary source article that they reference, either hyperlinked or that I could find that talked on the same subject. And I would have that. I'll go, hey, here's what it says. Boom, there's the link. Enjoy.
Yeah, I have an advantage because I'm an old fart and I've been at this a long time.
Yeah.
So I've got a huge data field, not only of the technical science work that I'm constantly expanding, and that's another thing that I really can't overstress, is keeping up with the primary source literature up front. If you need to have a shorthand mechanism, Science, Nature, and Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, those three, check those weekly. They're weeklies. Find out what the latest literature is, whatever your area of interest is, any of that stuff that pops up onto your field that occurs from there. Now, in Science and Nature, you'll only get the abstracts. They're never open access. Well, they're once in a while open access. Sometimes some major genetic field analyses will be made open access after a while. But if you're a college student, you probably got direct access. Hello, Robert.
Hey,
yes,
Robert.
hi, Robert. Yeah, the whole methods approach is very hands-on. I know that there may be a lot of people who go, oh, footnotes, ooh, sources, bibliographies, references, isn't that boring? Oh, no. That can tell you loads about somebody. Just from the structure of things, just from the way the source analysis is constructed. I've already, because I'm totaling up the number of sources in this book, he's got like 62 or so far, and of which only about a third are technical. And I'm at page 43, 44, around in there. So they're averaging about 1.5 sources per page, which is way below the 4 sources per page average that I'm running in Evolution Slam Dunk, and I didn't feel that even I had tackled the whole depths of the side issues that I brought up, although I covered the reptile mammal transition in detail. And so it'll be fun to find out where they end up on it. I've deliberately not spoiler alerted myself by looking ahead in the book. I want to kind of go at it one step at a time. I know that Sanford's a young Earth creationist, and so I bet you Rupe is too. Maybe, maybe not. But I'll be curious to see what they're going to end up doing as their main explanation. Their argument on the Neanderthal is that they're just normal people, and they just got some peculiar characteristics, and that these fossils that they're finding broaden the range so much that it's all just shows you how diverse human beings are. Well, yeah, I put all those papers up so that you can read what the actual technical literature is saying, and that's not what they're saying. And so you got to look at the idea that is Rupert so far away from the data field because he hasn't bothered with a lot of the recent material that he doesn't realize that this position of Neanderthal doesn't make sense. But it does make sense in the idea that as you go back about 600, 700,000 years, you have a very diverse group of pre-human hominids that include Homo erectus and heidelbergensis and and eventually the ones that lead to Neanderthal. And there's ones that are in various regional zones are coalescing into new morphs and a new species. And Homo neanderthalensis is one, and rudolfensis and others. And down in Africa, we've got that African clade swinging back and forth that's gradually ending up about 300,000 years ago, it looks like, with the current data. The first of the official Homo sapiens, we with the big jutting chin and the relatively minor brow ridges and a somewhat different skull shape that's very distinctively different from Neanderthals and all that. But we're close enough related, even though there was hundreds of thousands of years between the common ancestry split, for them to be able to interbreed now and then successfully. And we still have little snippets of Neanderthal DNA in our genome. What they're going to have, another problem is too, that they're overstating the case on some of the Neanderthal art issue. And I put a paper up too about this matter of, it was a particularly funny thing to do because it was about a completely different issue. I'll read the little text of what they were saying on it. It was where they cited that one of the individuals in this Cima de los Huesos in Spain, that relates to that Arzuaga paper and the series that I put up on there. They write that the individuals appear to have been deliberately disposed of as opposed to accidentally falling to their death. A nice generic way of putting it. When you look down in footnote 48, it turns out to be a link to a website, and that turned out to be the Devlin paper or website posting, and I put that up as a direct link. It was about an apparent case of murder where it looked like that somebody had bumped off one of their fellows, and to hide the body, they threw it down a cave. And it's still a circumstantial argument in a very old crime scene that's 400,000 years old. So it's not easy to resolve. But it's interesting that they didn't want to deal with that because what we're talking about are not humans. This is before the human species has originated. This is in the group that's in that murky European mode that's already produced Neanderthals, but apparently has some not quite Neanderthals. That's what they're talking about. They're not talking about weirdly divergent human beings who were maybe burying their dead, which is the implication that Rupe was trying to do in the way he phrased it. No, it's not that. So you can go ahead and read the paper. I put the actual paper of that. Was another omission. Why is Rupe citing a secondary source? Why is he citing a commentary paper when the paper in PLOS was open access? He could. That's always open access. Why isn't he linking to the original technical paper? That's yet another measurement of their methods. Jump in.
Yeah, I just had a question on what you said. So to make sure I understood, I just want to make sure I understood it right. They were actually, the Neanderthals or whoever was referenced here was actually burying their dead or something?
Not in this case. Although there are Neanderthal burials, there's no doubt about that.
Mm.
And he needs some even open air stuff. That there's some more recent material that's come along
Okay.
since. But in this particular case, apparently it's a body disposal,
Okay.
and it's somebody that's been hit in a way that's that is consistent with a crime, rather than just an accidental bump
Oh,
into a rock or something like that. And so the original
okay.
paper in PLOS, it may pan out over time, it may not. But the point is, it's raising an interesting issue about behavior, and it's in a non-human species.
Well,
And that's
yeah, I
the
was,
thing that the creationists can't allow, is for non-human species to be almost human, or
yeah.
really,
Well,
really
there
virtually
was,
human, independent of us.
well, there was a story a while back. I'll see if I can find the article for it. That I read about because it raised some. I think it was actually. I think if I remember correctly, her apologia video. But I want to say it was actually Answers Just who actually. I think it was a news story that they did on their Answers News. But it was a chimp who who basically ended up killing another chimp. It was literally murder, and the society, the social structure group, literally outcasted the other chimp, and the chimp, I think, actually tried to do something with the body. So it's like that's
Very
would make
human
sense.
behavior. Yeah.
Yeah, because it was
And
like the title was like because I think if I remember the title of the article, I think I found it. It was very sensationalized. Like, can a chimp commit murder? Because it was just like that was one of those like, okay, that's
yeah.
weird enough. I got to
Oh,
click on
Robert
it.
Richardson has a question from the live chat. You're curious
Oh,
to hear how the creationists explain the papers that show the Neanderthal gene markers are entirely outside the human range.
yeah,
Short answer is they don't.
yeah. I was about
Um,
ready to also. I was going to ask that earlier when you had talked about the genes. Was don't we have the Neanderthal genome pretty well mapped, and it's
yeah.
nowhere near a human? So how can it?
Well, it's got overlaps in some areas, but there's enough different in it, and particularly now, there was, I didn't put a linkage in the thing because it was a side issue, and they may end up relating it in other contexts in this book. So if I bump into it or not, but there's some work on some recently found Neanderthal kids, that they found the bones of, and this tells you about the growth patterns in the skull, and it's not within the human range. It's at a developmental level is doing stuff that's different than what we find in any human range, and that ultimately translates into the genes, which they'll be able to physically be able to identify in future as to which genes and what regulators are changing that are producing the Neanderthal morphology. Outside of that, oh, Jackson, I thought I put the linkage up. If you wanted to join the show directly, you're all welcome. Come drop it in. Anyway, the Neanderthal are just deliciously close to people, and the fascinating thing is that they did seem to be producing some proto art stuff. There's symbolic behavior of arranging stones in this particular cave that they found. I haven't put a linkage up on that. That's all very new material, and we'll see how well that
Yeah,
fleshes out, because they got to confirm dates on stuff and all that. And it's always wise never to jump the gun on the latest thing. Let
yeah.
the
I
dust
think
settle for a while first. But we do know that the Neanderthals apparently had some sense of some symbolic stuff. They used ochre and various paintings, so they probably painted their faces with things, and I'm sure that had a symbolic significance for them. But the
yeah,
issue is that we humans jumped the gun even higher, and it didn't happen all at once. We didn't start doing this right out of the gate. We've apparently got a couple 100,000 years of not doing the stuff that we see us doing much later on in cave art, where we are producing representations of stuff. So the idea that there would have been the occasional Neanderthal Da Vinci and the human being Da Vinci, that helps jumpstart things, that has innovators, and that then picks up and gets built on as a culture. But because they don't have the written language systems, and they don't have some of the communication abilities that would happen later on, it's much slower. And this is borne out by tool making, where once a new tool form develops, it stays really stable with relatively little modification for like 1,000,000 years in the case of the tool making that the Homo erectus bunch were doing. And that's conservatism up the yin yang. So it's telling us things about ultimately what's going on in the neurobiology, the relationships of innovation, how human beings or proto-humans are connecting up stuff. And that's why that whole comparative anatomy, comparative psychology, looking at ethnology, seeing what our primates can do, what they deal with culture, tool usage, even though it's much more primitive, they're hampered by the lack of language. And I think I discussed in a couple of the previous shows, and I'll reiterate it because it's an important point, is that what makes us distinctively human is the fact that we utilize language in a much more intricate way. And it's probably a feedback loop to where our understanding of tool use and our understanding of myths and our creating of gods and all this other stuff is all happening as a giant feedback loop. And other animals didn't do that for reasons that we are not yet clear about, but bit by bit they're ferreting out things about what genes have shifted and what little stimulus was different and whether a particular habitat had to be involved with this. And bit by bit, they're working it out. And not much of that's going to enter into the creationist worldview because they got a little box. Richardson put up a further commentary there about how the genes are near, but the markers, which are areas not acted on by natural selection, so accumulate mutations in a measurable array, all those cute little introns and retrotransposons and all that stuff, they show they're all diverged from all human lineages. And the thing that really is looking kind of surprising is not that Neanderthals interbred a bit with humans, but that they were able still to interbreed a little bit with humans and contributed a little bit of DNA. But we know hybridization takes place in fairly closely allied species. Farther you get removed along farther, more distant cousins, the harder it is to do that. Not impossible.
Yeah,
but harder. And it all depends on the zygotic isolation mechanisms and chromosome matchings. And there's a whole bunch of technical literature on that as to why some things work and some things don't. So we boinked a little with the Neanderthals.
Yeah, I just got a question for Robert here. What does he think he's doing, bringing facts and data and all that evil stuff, into this conversation about science? Oh, wait, that's what we're supposed to do. Never mind.
Yeah. And so I hope everyone will follow up on all the papers that I put up in the main shop, because those are all open access. Everybody can get at them. And they're useful litmus tests, because if you're going to be debating human evolution with a creationist or an intelligent design advocate, you may need to be able to deal with it at a fairly technical level, ideally. And so if you read one of those papers and it all sounds like Martian, then whoa, that's a clue you're out of your field and depth. And you can download it and read it and look at it and study it. And when you find that if there are parts that are unclear, terminology in that, you can Google, you can look stuff up, and also follow the trail, follow the source methods trail, because when they're making assertions in the technical paper, there's going to be references they offer. And when there's something that you're going, oh, I don't know, what does that mean? Look up the source that they cited and see what that's discussing. And bit by bit, you can get the trail going to where you're now understanding what their jargon is. You're understanding the terminology and special things that are involved. You're understanding the dating technology, the genetic information more, and how they're using particular tools and what CRISPR might mean and all these other things that might be popping up in various contexts. And bit by bit, you'll build up a frame where you'll begin to understand the material and ask questions. If you've got in a college environment, if you've got an anthropology department, pump them up for questions. Go in and ask people or grad students or anybody else, people on social media. You can put questions up in a lot of different contexts. I have fun on Twitter because whenever I encounter a scientist that's in my data field and I discover that they're on Twitter too, I go follow. And that means they're going to probably be letting me know in every one of those followers their latest work or the work they consider important. So I literally had people pop up and say, this is an important new paper on this particular issue. And I wouldn't have known about that otherwise, because I can't follow every bloody journal everywhere. There's not enough time of the day to do that. But if you have a series of networks of people that you connect up with, somebody in the network will know almost everything collectively. And it speeds up the process enormously. It means you can now move faster through the data field than your opponents can. And that's an advantage. If you can move through the data field ahead of the creationist, and you see in this book here how far behind the data field they are, how slow they are. I noticed that with Michael Denton too, in Slam Dunk, about how he would just skim the surface of his sources. He wouldn't really go diving down deep to find out deeper structure, and let alone apply it to his own conception, because he hadn't actually worked that out. And that becomes really clear at that source data level.
Yeah.
About halfway through the show here, I'll put up a CM. Oh, we got Azrael is also hello.
Yep.
And I'll put up my.
It almost seems like I know this is more of a joke than anything, but it's I don't remember who I heard say it, but it was like, whenever you're arguing with a creationist, remember it's against their religion to use any sources younger than 50 years. And it almost seems like that's almost like what they do.
It's not quite the case that you do find them making use of more recent source material. And there are techno geeks, the fact claimant bunch, I call them, are the ones who actually offer the sources. Let me put my screen share on. I'll put my shameless plug up while we're doing this. While we've got there's all the patrons. Everyone can observe the patrons: Stephen and Dyer and Eat and Yui and Mona and Henril and Jen and Jody and Daniel and Ralph and Eric and Benjamin and Staggles and Alex and Totus Real and Everett and Paul. And you can see my website. You can see the Patreon. You can see the GoFundMe. Come to the GoFundMe. Old RJ can use all the help he can. I'll just keep that up while I'm saying that you've got some like David Capege and a lot of the gang at Answers in Genesis and the Institute for Creation Research. They've got their techno geekies who will be riffing off of the current literature, the same way that the thing that Paul parodies on Ham and Eggs. They're scavenging the current technical literature. Elizabeth Mitchell at Answers in Genesis does this. She has the news to know stuff. And they're basically seeing the latest science paper that's daring to say evolution. Ooh, bad, bad. And so they'll snark on it, and they'll find a way of dismissing it. Well, that's them keeping up with the science data in their own clumsy little way. We have got to be way better than that. We have got to be as good as they are and 10 times better. And that means that we can have the advantage of keeping ahead of their data field in such a way that more often than not, when I'm finding a creationist citing the source, once in a while I'll have found something in this analysis here, that those Arsuega papers that I put up. The 1990 one, I didn't have in my bibliography. Why? Because it's old. I didn't need to bother about it because it was the old original research. The more recent material was already in my data field because I had already hit it, because I'm following PNAS and Science and Nature and all the rest. So I only had to look up the old paper because they were bringing it up, but I already knew about the newer papers, and I could then observe them not bringing those up. Now, you wouldn't have known that immediately if you weren't already ahead on the field. And so everybody, you like design elements and design interest, and other people will have different things. Other people will like astronomy. Others will like paleontology. Others will love developmental biology. Jackson Wheat will have his own specialty areas that he'll be fascinated with, systematics and a lot of that. So everybody will have the thing they're the geek on. And what you want to do is you can focus on that, and with an eye on paying attention to what the incoming technical literature is, and then keeping an eye on whether any anti-evolutionists bump into it or not. And that means if any of them do, you're already ahead of them because you already know the data field. And if it's really relevant stuff and they don't bring it up, that's even better because you can bring it up. And you'll know they won't know anything about it. So you're operating from a position of strength and knowledge, and you can pick and choose what trapdoors to maneuver them in front of, which you wouldn't be able to do if you were just drawing on secondary apologetics because you'd read a Bill Nye book or something.
Yeah, and it's and one thing I've always, I've always done for, for any time I'm looking for any information on anything, if I'm going to make an argument on anything, I will find the source that I'm looking for, and then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go, okay, well, this was in 2012 or so. I'm going to go, well, it's 2018. I guarantee there's been a little more research within the 6 years. Let's see if I can find something a little newer. I want to find the newest one. If I can't find anything past 2012, well, I do have you and and Jackson I could probably get a hold of and ask, but I would ask around saying, hey, do you know of anything newer? And
You
if you
can
do,
use Google Scholar.
yeah,
I tend to use a nice old-fashioned way because it picks up stuff that Google Scholar might not get, which
okay,
is I Googled the title of the paper. I copied the title down as it was in the thing, and I put it in as a Google search. And you'll pick up not only the paper, and you may find also that a paper
okay,
that wasn't available open access on the website, a Nature paper, for example, the author in a bunch of co-authors, some of the authors will have posted it free on ResearchGate or Academia EDU or at their college website. And so sometimes you can end run and find the full text of the paper available that you wouldn't spot if you didn't do a search
yeah,
that way. And then you'll also find if non-technical people are dealing with it. So sometimes I'll put the paper in and I'll go down, look at page 2, look at page 3, look at page 4 to see if it pops up on any creationist website or not. Because they'll tend to be slavishly accurate in typing out the page, the whole title of the thing, just like I would. And you can tell that, okay, looks like nobody's brought this up. So that means you can literally know that the information that you are reading in the technical paper, literally no creationist apparently has bothered to study or comment on. And
yeah,
that now is an extra piece of information you can use in your favor to know what's been discussed and what hasn't. I've got in my master spreadsheet, I keep track of what's been cited and what hasn't. And so I'll look down and I can see so I get paper and I can see that one of them has been cited by secondarily by some intelligent design person, but the other ones haven't. And all of that stuff you can tell. So you can now see at that meta-analysis level, a level of what's been discussed and what's been left out. And most
yeah,
of the time, it's a matter of stuff that's left out.
yeah. Yeah, like I said, if I don't understand something, I'm glad I know you and a bunch of other people who do different fields, and it's always, I can always go to them going, hey, would you mind clarifying this for me? Because I think it's saying this, but I'm not for sure.
Yeah,
Just to make
and
sure
that's
I have
good.
my
It's
information
good
right.
questions. No such
Yeah,
thing. Even ideologically motivated questions are still questions. And
yeah,
so I have never any problem with a question. I also
yeah,
don't get thrown off by the presentation context structure. Some people are awfully persnickety. They're looking at a thing and, oh gosh, there's all these footnotes, or there's all these references that I got to look in the back, or there's hyperlinks I got to follow up on, or they're writing it in a style I don't like. I prefer that they would be writing it differently. That's medium. That's not content. I could care less how they could write it in iambic pentameter. They can put it up in cartoons. I don't care the format. I'm only looking at what
yeah,
claims are they making, what information are they citing in support of it, and do they show an indication of playing fair with the facts and following up? And that will come through independent of the superficial structure of the work. That's, yeah, I could care less about that.
yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, it's, there's just, like I said, I don't care how it's presented to me as long as it's proven to be accurate. That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for, okay, what do you have? What are you saying? And how good is it?
Yeah, one thing that is another giveaway is what evidence would change their mind? What
Yeah,
would be a counter argument? And what I've been hoping to see, and so far have not in this Sanford book, is what exactly do they think a branching speciation event that produced human beings out of a hominid is going to look like? What are its criteria? What is the form of evidence they would accept? And I'm suspecting as I go through this that they're never going to think about that. That's one of the big giant blind spots, that they will tell you why it's not this and it's not that and it's not that, but not what it would need to be for them to say, well, yeah, I guess it is.
yeah,
That's one of the giant blind spots, because literally I don't know of any counterexample in the anti-evolution literature. So what it is you're looking at the 3-card money game as applied to evolutionary issues. It's the hide the ball bit, that they have a perspective on things, that human beings are specially created. And if they're young Earth creationists, that means human beings are only 6,000 years old, and all human beings on Earth are descended from Noah's and the kids 4,500 years ago. That's a hidden presumption in their frame that they may not want to tell you about. There's apparently a whole chapter later on in the book where they're going to go into radiometric dating. And that means that that was like, well, duh, because if they're young Earth creationists, they're going to be wanting to have to undermine that dating system. Whereas a non-young Earth creationist could care less about the dating system. They could just rely upon the dates and, okay, so-and-so is 1,000,000 years old. This is 400,000, blah, blah, blah. But then they make, anti-evolutionists then in the old Earth creationist front make another form of mistake. It's, yes, they don't deny the dating. They just don't make sense of the dating. They don't try to put all the data into a chronological map of time frame and then account for what they think is happening. Hugh Ross falls into this. I have no clue what that guy thinks was going on for the last 300,000 years with human beings. It's just a fog. Whereas your young Earth creationist has a very rigid model. I see gonna go for it. Is in the room. Hi, Peter. And so these issues about source methods and checking up on terminology so that you understand the phenomenon, that it improves your understanding. Never try to argue with somebody about something you don't understand. That's a big problem. Because you'll only end up looking like a fool if they know, even if they are good at bluffing. Look at President Trump going with Trudeau, and he just makes numbers up out of his ass. That there will be creationists will do exactly the same thing. And if you know the data field well, that's why I was so happy with the reptile-mammal transition thing of finally getting that work dealt with, because I'm on really solid ground there. I know literally every possible argument that the anti-evolutionists can put forward because I've read all of their stuff. So that means that I can ferret through, I know what questions to ask to reveal what they don't know. And if they do bring up a thing, I know what that source read completely, and I fact-checked it. When I can ask them, well, did you fact-check it?
Yeah, and with me, that's why, a lot of times because I know that people who are creationists, whether it be young or old, they have to go with we are designed. They cannot argue against it because they believe God created us, so therefore we have to be designed. And that's why 90% of the time, whenever I argue against creationists, I'm mostly using design arguments because if someone tried to argue geology against me, I'm like, I'm not gonna. I know enough on it to say stuff, but I'm not enough to really argue it.
It's a fascinating thing because, say, the intelligent design people, Behe and others will argue, well, we don't claim that the design needs to be perfect, and so the argument from imperfection doesn't affect us. But if you read their arguments, closely, they do believe in an argument of perfection. That they really can never acknowledge the idea that the designer put in stupid stuff. They can never allow that.
I will have to argue that whoever says that we don't believe the design is supposed to be perfect, then you don't understand the first thing about design, because your designs have to be perfect. And when I say this, I am not joking. Mistakes
You're aiming it to be
cost lives.
Yeah,
and
that's the problem.
Lives.
That
go look at Kansas City Skywalk.
Yeah, Behe is a perfect example of this, of where he's tried to argue, and I discussed it in the Creationism Light chapter at TIP, where he went into this. He's trying to wriggle around the theodicy problem, which is the imperfect design or malfunctioning systems, things that are doing stuff, cancers and diseases that arise because the system is working as it's supposed to. It just has a design defect in it, and that will produce leukemia is a perfectly fine example. Your immune system can turn on you. And it's doing its trick. It's getting rid of you because it's now regarding you as the problem. And that kind of thing would be regarded as the thing you could put a lawsuit up on if it was designed by a human designer. It's the Titanic iceberg problem. It's how I describe it as well. And but when push comes to shove, no intelligent designer is really willing to accept the idea that the design had goof parts in it.
Yeah,
it's always got to be due to something else.
And that's where, right there, if someone said that the design doesn't have to be perfect, right then and there, you just lost. Because if anyone ever says that, they are a flat out moron.
It also implies that the designer is
incompetent.
Definitely not perfect.
Yeah.
That the Titanic is a perfectly fine example. The Titanic versus iceberg. You cannot lay blame on the iceberg. The iceberg is doing iceberg thing. It's not intentional. The iceberg wasn't malicious. It didn't lie in wait, plotting to sink ships. It didn't do a damn thing. It just is an ice. It's a blob of ice. It
Yeah.
floats along, and an idiot bumps into it. And bingo, you have a disaster. But once you have an object of design, everything about it is now amenable to study as to whether it was a good or a bad design, and therefore morally appropriate or not. So whether or not, why didn't you have lifeboats enough? Why wasn't the rivets better designed? Why did you not extend the watertight compartments up past E deck? Every one of these things now becomes a matter of decisions that are being made by self-aware entities that you can give them, you can understand why they made the mistakes they did, but they're still mistakes.
Yeah. Oh,
and, and God supposedly is too clever for that.
Yeah, and I'll say this, and I've said it before, but if I was an engineer and I was the one approving the plans for, as a designer would have to have them done, or he would have to approve them himself, sign off on them, if he was just like a one horse show designer where he's the only one working at building and he gets the contract. But if I was the one who was approving the plans, I'm going to sit down, look at the plans, and, well, God or whoever you want to attribute as the designer would be laughed out of my office and would be blacklisted. They would never work another day of design in their life.
No one would design stuff. No one argues that living systems aren't immensely complicated and fascinating, and they do wonderful things. But some of the wonderful things they do are in spite of the weirdness of things. And the main point is not perfection or imperfection. It's the contingencies of lineage. That a clever idea of the intermittent windshield wipers on cars are a perfectly fine example. Once it dawned on people that was a really good idea, every car manufacturer adopted it because it's clever. But that's not open for living systems. That if one lineage develops a really clever thing, no matter how nice it would be for it to be in another lineage, unless it can develop naturally, it ain't going to happen. Yeah, and so you don't get the schizochroial eyes, these particular forms of eyes that are in trilobites, the creationists have riffed off of. I think I got a section on that again in, I think in chapter 4, or one of those chapters in Old. They that occurs only in one lineage of trilobites. It doesn't occur in any of the others. Why? Because it's an evolving system. No designer said, oh, I really like schizochroidal eyes. I really think the trilobites ought to have these, and so goes in outside of the facopids and decides to design them in there, which a designer could do. But there's no designer.
Yeah,
it's all natural lineage.
And on the argument of complexity, I love when people bring that up, because that actually, in my opinion, works against design itself. Because with a design, you want as little, stuff in there as possible. You want the bare bones minimum of what you need to make the system work, because the more you put in, the more can go wrong.
There is a limit to that. Something, this is ironically where engineers can learn a little bit from nature and vice versa.
Okay.
It's hard to look at a standard internal combustion engine compared to a Wankel and not see that the internal combustion engine is more complicated. And yet it actually works better, because it turns out the Wankel is not forgiving of error. Whereas literally we drove in an internal combustion Chrysler engine for 3,000 miles with no oil in it. and it didn't fall apart. So it's very forgiving of error. It's kludgy, K-L-U-G-E, kludge is one of the terms that pops up. The idea of just kind of workable but clunky, and a lot of living systems function a bit like that. All the bits about our immune system and the very intricate mechanisms on mechanisms on mechanisms to get rid of errors in the DNA code, or to remove misfolded proteins and stuff. It's like one other little fix-it things comes along and another thing happens there. And because we're looking at that system billions of years later, we see that it's a lot of things going on. But that doesn't mean it all started out that way.
Yeah, and I guess more what I was saying with the complexity part was, we have stuff in us that does make us complex, but also that we don't necessarily need. I mean, we can live without an appendix. We don't need that. And that is a fine example of the complexity of our body with the appendix, of something that can go horribly wrong.
Well, there was an example of something that in other animals was performing a normal function. And then we got onto a lineage sighting where we don't need it. We don't
Yeah,
have need
yeah,
of a secondary tummy.
and
And
it's
but the problem is that there are things that occur if you get rid of it. In part of the problem was that in order to disconnect that from the system would involve some implausible sets of mutations. So you're basically stuck with something you don't use very more. And then
yeah,
on top of that, as it turns out, that little bag of cells down there that's no longer functioning as a secondary tummy can act as a habitat for bacteria, which then end up being useful in our immune system. So that in some respects the appendix does have external functionality anymore. It just wasn't what it started out doing. And of course, creationists have come in and say, see, it's designed after all. Well, not
no.
to do what it does now.
Yeah,
That's a
and
contingency.
that's what I was referring to, is that because it's no longer really serves the purpose and can be detrimental to the design, if you want to argue that we are designed. That's why I was saying, as a designer, I would completely cut it out, because
Yeah, you could
it's
easily
more
remove stuff.
detrimental.
Here's the difficulty
And
is
that's what I
that
was meaning.
the design advocates are always wanting to say all the neat things of design. They are not
Yeah.
willing in practice to allow for bad design or dangerous design. So they have a terrible problem thinking about parasitical organisms.
Oh yeah.
They really
It's
it's a tough maneuver to think about. One of the things that caused Darwin to be creeped out about the idea of design was he found out about all these parasites, and he's going, wow, would a designer do that?
yeah,
Why do you
no.
go about doing that? Why do you make a system that's so complicated that it can fall apart? So now you have to create another system to prevent it from falling apart, which has byproducts that means you have to do this to compensate that. It's turning into a big cascading Rube Goldberg thing.
Yeah,
But that
it's
sort of thing is exactly what you would expect in an evolving system where there's
exactly.
no one in charge and
Yeah,
it's only
and
one person.
because and that's exactly what I'm you explained it perfectly for what I was mean by the complexity part of working against it, because you're having to put all these extra systems, all these extra things into this design plan of nature and life,
Yeah.
that it literally it's inevitable. It's going to just collapse in on itself because it becomes too complex. But in nature, it would make perfect sense for what we know about nature and evolution and biology and everything else that we have, for it to look like this, because
Yeah.
nature's just going, oh, you got this part, well, let's try this here. Oh, that failed. Well, you're now extinct. You're not. That wasn't a good idea, and it
Yeah, in
it
fact,
went
this is
away.
another thing. I got into a long discussion. There was this paper on demarcation and what is pseudoscience that was being put forward for review on Academia EDU. And so I was one of those that got the alert on it, and I looked into it. And as a side issue, this idiot creationist was just railing on and on that Darwinism had to be wrong because there should be, and I've heard this argument from other people on Twitter, that there should be all of these mutants. If evolution were true, you should just have a pile up of mutants, and you'd have all these weird deformed creatures that would be preserved in the fossil record. And
Oh,
I'm going, no, you wouldn't.
wow.
No.
No.
And not any of any macroevolution that I can think of involves a weird non-functioning mutant as an intermediate stage.
Yeah,
Ever.
it's what's is basically, okay, well, this set of species are best designed for this. And then from there, you will see it go, oh, okay, well, now that the environment or whatever changed, or they moved or somehow got separated from the group that they were at, and then they start breeding, and then they're like, oh, our environment is different. Now these set survive.
Yeah.
That's what you're going to see. You're going to see life become basically form and mold to whatever environment it happens to live in.
What I did then, I applied again, or tried to apply source methods to this poor schnook, because I kept on asking him again and again and again, will you please tell me any scientist, any evolutionist, any biologist who says there ought to be a pile up of mutants in the fossil record? And it's not an issue, because there wouldn't be, there couldn't be, and evolution doesn't require there to be in order to work. In fact, quite the opposite. That every single thing that ends up being seen as a significant macroevolutionary transition will have been composed of nothing but little tiny microevolutionary blips. And that's why the reptile mammal transition is so spectacular, because there is no jump anywhere in that. Everything is all within the range of natural variation. And you start out with things that look like perfectly garden variety reptiles on one end, and you go down the parade ever so gently. It looks so much similar, so much similar, so much similar, until you get down to the end where you realize, holy moly, we got mammals now.
Yeah, and it's I mean, one of the Beach points out another good point of, design and where it just fails, and that's the wisdom teeth. Because we don't need our wisdom teeth. They are actually a hindrance to us now. So any designer would look at that and go,
why put them in there?
I can't
Yeah,
fit that in there.
the tooth enamel is my favorite. That literally all toothless mammals still have tooth enamel genes. And even animals with teeth, mammals with teeth that have no enamel, have tooth enamel genes. And it's because all of them came from lineages where it hasn't been long enough for all of those little pseudogenes to be wed out of the system, because there's no cleanup crew to do that. It doesn't, if it's not bothering you, that gene can sit there indefinitely and it's not being expressed. And so it just is sitting there inside the biology. But they found out about this because baleen whales that have no teeth, they start out with embryos of the teeth, but they then disappear in the embryo, and you get the baleen forming. And there's papers that they're working on how that the baleen evolved and so forth. They even have a transitional form that's in the early stages of that. And so it's just pile up of stuff. That how does the anti-evolutionists deal with all of that data? Well, they don't deal with the data. They don't read the work. They don't conceptualize their map of time. They don't work out what transitional forms would need to look like. They don't study the genetics. They don't study the paleontology. They're 900 miles away from the data field. And if you remove it far enough and squint carefully, it can look like design if you don't get too close. Yeah. But what you'll never be able to do is do predictions. You won't be able to be following up on the field and all that stuff. Well, on that complicated cell systems, for example, that's why in my research them for origin of life, I include in that everything connected to DNA repair, because that's, to my mind, even though it's not necessarily in the earliest biological systems, it's part of that weird little quality control system that's part of origin of life research for me. And as yet we don't know how a lot of that stuff comes about, and they keep on finding new things. And so some of these things may be new inadvertent cleanup systems that have evolved long after there was a problem, because there's an interesting thing called the error threshold issue, which is in the origin of life. If you replicate and have too much of a toleration for error, then you'll have a point where it'll just fall apart. And if it doesn't have enough mutations, though, you don't have the grist for evolution. So there's this little boundary layer of how high up on the mutation rate do you go before you start hitting the error threshold. And it's still a fascinating dynamic to try to work all of that stuff out. Well, all of these little counteracting systems that come into play on there, I think are part of this incredible dance of replicators. That's clues about what was going on deep in the origin of living self-replicator systems. And all we're seeing is the remnants of these that have kind of homed into a nice little static balance to take care of problems in the system, each doing their own thing completely non-intelligently. It's all just the mechanism doing the thing, blah, 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 blah. And so it's a fascinating subject to follow up on. But what intrigues me is how uninterested anti-evolutionists are in it. That they don't really, they praise the great designer and the wonderful works, and he made platypuses and some little cross-shaped molecule and so forth and so on. But other than that, they're not terribly interested in working out too many of the details on that. Yes, I'm just being asked for to give a wrench to Peter in there, and I was forgetting. It says, how am I going to give him a tool? And what I mean is that we need to have him as somebody that can go in and put links up. There
Yeah,
we
because
go.
he has one that he's talking about a Ninja Turtle in the fossil record. I'm thinking he's going to reference that. Is what it looks like. But
Yeah, they found a lot of new
but
stuff about
but
some of the material. Anything that's after the Triassic is
yeah,
almost yawn, because by then turtles have developed.
yeah,
But the
and
interesting thing is the earliest stages of turtle evolution, and they found more and more material, both on the developmental side as to how turtle shells form and what parts of the shell is forming from what, and then also the fossil record side, where they've realized that it's starting up in one half of the shell and only later developing elsewhere. And so there's, even though not every blip on the scope is known now, a hell of a lot is known now that wasn't known even 10 years ago.
yeah, and with design, we were talking about where they all want to praise the great designer. I love when they do that, because you just opened it up for all the bad parts of the design. Are you going to praise them for
Yeah.
that? And most people are like, well, no, that's because of blah blah blah, and they give you some really
It's
BS.
because of the fall of man and Satan.
Yeah,
So they attribute it to that. But that's a dodge.
it's
That's
yeah,
a maneuver around the data field, because if you
I
attribute anything to design, you got to contribute all of it to design.
yeah,
At least
because
Isaiah was
I
consistent. He attributed everything, good and bad, to God. That was what a
yeah,
monotheistic deity was. Well, anyway, we're at 6 o'clock here. And I've got that. I'll give the advert for next week. I'll be continuing the analysis of all of this stuff. Anybody that's terribly interested in human evolution will be then being tracked through a lot of the technical material that'll be popping up as I look at the stuff that's brought up in the Sanford book and the stuff they don't bring up in the Sanford book. And then by the time I get down to the end of it, I'll have a complete mapping of the structure of their work, and I'll be able to tell you how much of it was legitimate source material, whether they ever had anything that actually was really supportive of their position or not. I've been still waiting for them to actually offer some material, whether that when they get down to cognitive literature, when they get down to the dating issues and some of these other stuff, that there is lurking a very specific worldview in that perspective. And I'm wondering how much of it they're going to let their readers know. In which case, if they don't, are they going to cite any baraminology work? That's another one that I'm going to be intrigued to find out if they do. Those are the creationists in the field. To not cite Wood and Kavanaugh and the various people that have done baraminology work on the human species is a weird omission on their part if they do it. And if they do bring it up, then they're going to have to deal with the fact that it's hard to reconcile with the dogma no matter what. So either way or another, it's going to be fascinating to see how they fare up. So far, they're playing completely consistently. They're relying on a lot of secondary sources and for authority quotes mainly, and they're stepping around data, sometimes to the point where they really must be getting like a back crick as to how quickly they're trying to maneuver around the data field that's in their own sources. And that's
yeah,
always a dead giveaway, that we've got somebody that has a dogma that they want to preserve and not just trying to fairly represent all the data.
yeah.
Okay. So we're going to be, thank you very much for showing up there. The website and links, and if you haven't followed my channel, and if you haven't gotten Evolution Slam Dunk or any of the other stuff that I've been doing, the old RJ can always use your support. Get up on the rooftops, tell people in social media, if magazine publishers or others, they'd say, hey, here's my books, and maybe you should pay attention to them, and so forth and so on. So I'm operating from my den here, but there's a bigger world out there. Hope you're enjoying the Evolution Hours. And Peter was saying, still waiting for some good baraminology. I want to know what kinds God created. Don't hold your breath on that, Peter.
Well,
one creationist. But just before I sign off, I'll point out one creationist thing at the Ark Museum actually had a picture of the kinds on the Ark. They got a chart, and they're very blurry, so you can't really tell what the hell they are, although you can see some of the higher level categories. And so they're kind of talking about 1,500 kinds, but they're all, I'd love to see the technical work on that.
yeah,
And the very fact that there's never been a detailed analysis at Answers in Genesis, why wouldn't somebody, Leitner or Wood or somebody else, Jensen, at Answers in Genesis have put up a baraminology paper at their own website in their Answers in Research Journal that would be the technical description of the kinds that are in the Ark encounter. Why would they have done that? Unless they've never done that and they're not gonna. That intrigues me. That omission is really fascinating because they can't say that they don't have a journal. Answers in Genesis Research Journal is their technical arm. So why wouldn't they publish something on that? And if anybody knows of anything like that that's popped up in any other venue, please let me know. Put it on Twitter. Go on to the TIP website and give me the links and stuff on that, whatever. Let me know of it. But I don't know of any, and I'd sure love to see it. That failure to document their own argument, that's another litmus test that you can use to analyze. It's the best case scenario argument. If you've got your evidence, why don't you present it?
Yeah.
If you come up with your claim and you don't present this fabulously good evidence that you've got, why not? Well, it's maybe because you don't have the fabulously good evidence. That's why you've never done a detailed analysis on it, because you can't.
Yeah, I love Beej's comment that they just made. Blurry kinds are Bigfoots. That's great.
The failure to make out a list, I pointed this out in some of the chapters in the old TIP work, is that you can find lists for evolutionists. Evolutionists will give you lists of all the vertebrate kind of animals, of all the different genera, all the different classes. You can rank Lynn Margulis's things that list the phyla and all of that. There's no shortage of that. You can work out. Aaron Ra has got his things where he's working out through the entire scope of the taxonomical system. You know, it's a lot of work. There's a lot of stuff there. And that means that's another problem, is that it's really not going to be easy for creationists to work out the created kinds, because there's so many things in the living world and in fossils. It's way bigger than cats and dogs and bears, that it's such a vast field of information that every time that they try to dive into it, they've got to start leaving stuff off the field and not thinking about this and not thinking about that, and will not bother about that, and we'll whittle that down, and I won't even think about that. And it's up to us to point out all the stuff they're leaving out and to know the stuff they're leaving out. So that nothing should be better than for evolutionists who are well informed to go to a creation museum and be able to poke holes in every single one of the displays right in front of everybody. That's what everybody should have, that level of skill set. And I won't rest until I get as many people as possible elevated up to that level to where we can go after it.
I need to start a fundraiser for to take a trip out to Kentucky to the Creation Museum, and I'll try and find a way.
I'd like to see if it eventually reaches the stage where I'm able to do so. And what I would like to do is an enfilade, which is where you have a small team of people who are properly trained as to who's doing what. Some people are the documenters with the cell phone live feeds. Some of them are the ones that are offering the technical descriptions, and others are the conversants that are saying, oh, what do you mean by that? Can you explain that? And blah, 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 where you are demonstrating the incompetence of the creationists on their own turf. And if any of the creationists want to interact with you, fine and dandy, and you remain polite and well-informed, and you shred them right in front of themselves in a way where nobody loses a temper, but you aren't given any ground. And at that level, everything that they have at both the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter have endless opportunities for showing the full data field. The fact that all of the critters that they put up at the Ark Encounter, all the prehistoric beasts, no creationist ever did any of that work. They're parasitizing the regular scientists. How did they think they found out about myosaurids and these velociraptors and stuff? And then the question is whether the feathered theropods, where are all these coelurosaurs? Where exactly are the psittacosaurids? Are they the same baramin as a protoceratopsid? And pretty soon on their own turf, you can have them tied up in knots, because they'd be like Ken Ham with Aaron Ra going, well, I don't really know that. I haven't really studied that. I haven't really thought about that. Well, excuse me, you're trying to be a science. You need to catch up at least to where science was in 1900, buckaroo, let alone 2018.
It's just, I mean, I would love to just go there with you and maybe a couple other people, just record some exhibits, and just because they get very, very touchy if you record. I mean, I've heard of
I'm going to try to do this locally or regionally. There's a local regional creation bunch that's going to have their annual convention in Seattle, and they haven't specified the exact venue and stuff yet. But what I'm going to try to organize are like-minded people that would be doing this enfilade approach at this convention, because it's open to the public. It's always been open to the public, and where we can take the best advantage of this. And I want to see how well this works. I don't think anyone's done this in this approach. P.Z. Myers's approach was to have like a protest out in front, and then maybe lectures that were nearby where they could give sciencey stuff. But that's missing the point. I wouldn't, if we were doing that aspect, I'd want to make sure that the lectures were not conflicting with the lectures that are going on inside the convention. I want people to be able to hear both, not just one. So I would want to have any lectures we would be doing, so that if someone could attend that and ours, and that there would be now a conversation going back and forth. So it's all a matter of timing and preparation and all of this kind of stuff. Because merely going up and having signs saying how stupid creationists are, that's missing the methods issue. And that's what you need to do. To do that, you've got to be in their den, and you've got to know their material better than they do, and you've got to be able to just have fun in pleasantly pointing out all the grave difficulties in there, to where you're just tying those poor little people up in knots and doing it with a smile.
Yeah, I would love to go to that. That would be fun, just to sit. I mean, I can always use a few cheap laughs, you know. I mean, I would be there and record it, and I would love to be there with you to do that. But I would just, be sitting there just like, oh God, this is going to be good for some laughs.
Yeah. And the thing is that it's not merely for the laugh parts. It's to demonstrate how powerful source methods is as a tool.
Yeah. I mean,
it's a game that isn't used nearly as much as it ought to be. It's the killer app. It's the game they can't play. It's the thing where they disintegrate right in front of you. You're going to get deer in the headlight looks constantly as you're pushing them to a boundary in a place they can't go to, because if they could go to it, they couldn't believe what they do. And you'll literally be able to spot it. And plus, it's darn fun. Well, anyway, I'm now shutting off. Thank you for everybody watching, and keep spreading the word about TIP. And if you haven't bought my books, what the hell's keeping you?